Welcome to another episode of Tack Right Now, the weekly podcast of the American Conservative. I'm Andrew Day, here with my colleagues Sumantra Maitra and Joseph Addington. Today we'll be talking about anti-war conservatism. What is it and how strong is it in the Trump 2.0 era? And we'll also discuss the related issue of conservatives growing more critical of some U.S. policies that relate to Israel. Next, we'll discuss Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's White House meeting with Donald Trump. We'll then talk about a new war between nuclear armed countries. So that's always fun. I'm thinking of India and Pakistan, of course. Finally, and briefly, we'll talk about the German government's latest aggressive move against the Alternative for Germany party. That's a right populist party and the most popular party in Germany, according to many polls. So before we jump into anti-war conservatism, I guess we should briefly address this breaking news that we all literally just saw on our Slack channel for, our workplace Slack. We have a new pope. Is that right? I think it's the first ever American pope. You'll have to excuse my ignorance. Do either of you want to talk about what we know so far?
Sure. So the new pope's name is, originally Robert Francis Prevost, a cardinal, but now under the papal name of Pope Leo the 14th. So we have a new Pope Leo. He is, yes, the very first American pope ever in 2,000 years. Um, and he's relatively low key. Uh, Disclaimer, none of us are Catholics here, so we'll have to wait for Jude to come onto the podcast to give us the full breakdown. Um, but uh, but Cardinal Prevost was considered a a very inconspicuous, very moderate sort of personality. So after Pope Francis, I don't think that's a relatively surprising pick, at least directionally. But I don't think pretty much anybody was expecting that we would get the first American pope this year. So I think that's going to be sort of the big news.
Yeah, and there's kind of a fat pope, thin pope thing, right? Like they usually go to someone who's very different from the previous pope. I mean, he is aligned, as I understand, on social justice issues with Pope Francis, but as you said, more low key. I think, wasn't he the guy that criticized JD Vance's comments on these concentric circles of obligation and affection? I think he wasn't so low key on that issue, but I might be mistaking him with someone else. Sumantra, do you know anything about his foreign policy views?
Yeah, no, I agree with Joseph. None of us are Catholics. I think this is going to be a unique Pope episode in the future that I can see with Michael Brennan Doherty and Jude Russo,
Yeah.
who are both Catholics. But couple of things which I want to mention. Like you mentioned, it's the first American Pope. This is the first Pope who actually has the mother tongue of English. That has never happened before. So in 2,000 years of history, this is the first Pope who actually speaks, whose mother tongue is English, like first language is English. The second point, which, and again, this we don't really know much about the Pope's foreign policy, which is going to be a big issue in the next few years. But like very briefly, before we go on to other topics, I think one of the things that we are going to see, there are a couple of trends globally that has happened. One, America is steadily Catholicizing. You That's part of that reason is Hispanic immigration. Part of the reason is like a whole bunch of conversion that's going on. A lot of people are converting to Catholicism. Even like former Protestants, for example, our current vice president, who was what, like he was a Baptist before he converted. And there's a whole bunch of Catholicism in America is one of the largest growing religions. Protestants are a lot less than they used to be. The second thing that, and again, this is purely my foreign policy brain that I've been thinking about, like one of the continents which is going to be a structural issue and competition between US and China is Africa. Africa is also a continent where the Americans have steadily tried, first through the evangelical church and then through the Catholic Church, to proselytize. There are a lot of issues that goes in Africa. The last pope was, I wouldn't say he was pro Beijing, but like he at least tried to kind of have like a relatively new equilibrium with the Communist Party in China. I don't think that is going to happen under the new pope. We might see a whole bunch of competition going on in Africa that that we are going to see. And given that China and US are both kind of trying to, it's kind of like we would probably see a more foreign policy pope in this avatar, like kind of like a Pope John Paul II in Africa, with a very limited regional Cold War between the more, because Africa is also the continent which is like the largest growing number of Catholic. The number of Catholics, Catholic converts in Africa is larger than a lot parts of Europe. So I think that is something which we are going to see. I don't really know much about his foreign policy. I don't know about the Ordo Mortis thing. I didn't even know that he criticized JD Vance. So that's something new, Andrew. You need to tell us about it.
I do not think that was him.
That
Was
wasn't him?
not.
That was not him, no.
Did you look it up just now?
We've got a steady fact checker here, Andrew. So yeah, to round up that point, I think purely from the foreign policy angle, I think we are going to see a lot more evangelism when it comes to Africa and a lot more confrontation with China. But we'll find out.
It's funny. Last time Jude Russo was on, he told us how to play the betting markets and what the various odds were for who the next pope was going to be. And now you, Sumantra, are giving us a nice realpolitik analysis of the pope. So, this is a very realist podcast when we talk about spiritual issues.
As far as the influence of the pope in America, I think I should point out, you talked about Catholic conversions in America. I should point out that America, like, proportionally is not becoming more Catholic. Catholics are becoming nuns or like agnostics or disassociating from religion faster than people are converting to Catholicism. The big influence in American politics is that Catholicism is quickly becoming the religion of the elite right. Formerly, that was dominated by the mainline conservatives through the WASPs, but the mainline Protestants have completely collapsed, and the WASPs as a class largely do not exist anymore. And
my counterpoint to that is Catholic. The elite religion of U.S. is turning towards Catholicism, but also the Catholics in the U.S. are becoming more Protestant when it comes to their political, angles. This is not the kind of Catholicism you would see in Latin America. This is not the kind of Catholicism you might even see in Africa. Catholicism in the U.S. is distinctly Protestant in culture when it comes to free speech and when it comes to immigration. There's a whole bunch of, ideas, including, when JD Vance goes and talks to in the Munich Security Conference, he's sounding very Protestant. If I'm, if I have to, put a political label to it, but like, I don't know, like I think you've raised a very important point about the elite. The ruling elite is not WASP anymore. It's more Catholic, and I think that's got a more long-term ramification.
Why did JD Vance sound Protestant to you? Because there's kind of a missionary component to his.
There was kind of there was kind of like an evangelizing. This is again something. This is like I've been hearing from my European friends who are like, listen, this is one of my friends, which I've written an essay about, which is going to come out. Is she mentioned a very interesting point. She was like, this is almost like listening to neoconservatives, but with a different ideological software, and that sentence like really struck me. Like, I mean, if we are, it is kind of true. It's very evangelizing in some ways, but also it is very narrow in a way that Catholicism doesn't really often sound. Like, this is about you look after your people, I look after my people. We are gonna share the burden on. It's a very Protestant frugal outlook, which is it's more Cardinal Richelieu than Cardinal Prevost, in my opinion. But we're gonna find out.
No, that's interesting. I mean, Protestantism is sometimes thought of as giving rise to this kind of liberalism and having this missionary component imparted on liberalism. So it is interesting. He's doing the missionary thing, but kind of pushing back against like global liberalism. That was the substance of his speech. Well, we really got to move on. But Joseph, you want to make one more point on this?
Yeah, I suppose. I should say, Catholicism has had an evangelical tradition. It just hasn't been very much expressed since the 20th century. But I think as far as the question of elite goes, I think the distinction is in Protestantism, in mainline Protestantism, you never had the kind of influence that like you see from the post-liberals. There's a very distinct approach there. As far as the influence of elite Catholicism on the right. So I think that is worth paying attention to. But we do have to move.
Okay, well, I was trying to find proof of my statement that this, Prevost criticized Vance. I still think he did, but I can't find any proof of that. So maybe I'm wrong.
Your Protestant is showing, Andrew.
Yeah, I grew up Southern Baptist in Alabama, of all places. But let's go ahead and jump right into anti-war conservatism. Obviously, the American conservative has always advanced an anti-war conservative viewpoint. Anti-war conservatives were marginalized during the War on Terror. And during the Obama years, most Republican criticism of Obama on foreign policy depicted him as weak and not militaristic enough. But Donald Trump created an opening for anti-war conservatives. In 2016, he really distinguished himself in the Republican primary by harshly criticizing the Iraq War and the Bushes. He often boasts that he started no new wars in his first term. This January, during his inaugural address, he said he wanted to be a peacemaker and avoid forever wars. I'd say there have been mixed results in that regard. Some recent data points related to the issue of anti-war conservatism. Matt Walsh of the Daily Wire wrote a post on X saying that Iran wasn't a threat to the United States. He also went on the Tucker Carlson show and criticized U.S. foreign aid, including assistance to Israel. Tucker Carlson, of course, is a leading conservative opponent of war against Iran and of neoconservatism generally. Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene came out against the war in Iran, as did the conservative influencer Charlie Kirk. So those recent developments kind of got us thinking of anti-war conservatism. There's obviously some infighting going on in the GOP. It's unclear if there's infighting going on in the Trump White House, but there seems to be competing factions on this, especially as it pertains to Iran. So, Sumantra, what's your sense of the current state of anti-war conservatism? How powerful is it, both in the Trump administration and in the broader culture, and who are its main voices?
Boy, that's a long political theory question. First of all, this idea that conservatism is pro-war is in itself a neoconservative, idea. Like conservatism by definition, like and yeah, I don't want to go for a long lecture on this one, but just I mean, obviously you guys already know, but like for those who don't, the traditional conservatism could have been divided between up until the French Revolution. There wasn't much of a difference. The countries and the church and state were all the same and all that kind of stuff. The American Revolution kind of changed that, but even then, America was like really isolated in a part of the world which doesn't really have too much of an influence in Europe or even like that much of a connection. But in Europe, which was at the height of its power, and the colonial governments and pretty much like all the great powers of Europe controlled majority of the world, there wasn't much difference. Like conservatives kind of like started to divide between how we say in the old country Toryism and more of a Burkean conservatism after the French Revolution. It was Burke, who was traditionally basically a liberal, who supported the American Revolution because to him it was a continuation of the original English Revolution in the 16th century. So he said that, look, these are the people who are actually fighting for their rights, and they are our fellow Englishmen. And look at their surnames, like they all sound English. This is a continuation of our revolution, so we should support them. But he was basically a liberal that way. Like he was talking about rights and all that kind of stuff. Whereas the Tories in England, who are more of in their times, more blood and soil. So again, there's a weird inverse going on currently anyway, but we're going to talk about that later on. But that was when conservatism as a political theory got divided around the French Revolution between a more liberal trend of conservatism or a more Burkean trend of conservatism, which is focused more on rights, and a more a Tory trend of conservatism focused on land and property and that kind of stuff. Obviously, these are not like binary, divisions. There are like various different, intermingling thought processes. But those are the two trends. America and England, given their maritime roots, had a more I wouldn't use the term isolation, but more of an isolated tendency when it comes to foreign policy, right? Even in the U.S., like Lord Canning spoke, he coined the term "splendid isolation" because, his coinage was like, Europe's domains end at the Atlantic, England's begin there. Like England was a distinct civilization. The English-speaking people are distinct people compared to the rest of Europe. We might look similar in some ways with the Europeans, but we are different when it comes to our culture, when it comes to our geography, when it comes to our history. England is a maritime country. We have maritime domains and interests, and the world is ours to conquer. That's kind of same tendency when it comes to America. So it's not like isolation per se, but it's more of an interest oriented thing. The difference was not neither England nor America was evangelical when it comes to war. The concept of using war in defense was embedded, or in defense of interest was embedded in both British and American foreign policy. But the concept of using war as an evangelical process and spreading values was not something which was prevalent. That changed around the time of Woodrow Wilson. Even like when people say that Teddy Roosevelt was a warmongering president, but Roosevelt, kind of like justified his wars on the basis of interest and geography. It was Woodrow Wilson who changed the entire idea and saying like wars are big because of values, or even like lack of wars are because of values. Like values are the determinant factor when it comes to foreign policy. And that slowly, that is no different, at least logical. The logical extension of that point is no different to Marxists or Trotskyists or neoconservatives who are saying, like, look, at the end of the day, we have to wage, it's a very Christian idea in some ways. Like, we have to wage this just war. The only difference is we don't, we define the just war not as a defense of interest, but as a defense of values. And that is why we have to, like, regardless of where there is injustice and tyranny, we have to go and topple them. So this entire idea is more radical. Like, it's not a conservative idea in the original meaning of the term. Like, there is nothing conservative about going to war to spread values. And the last point that I'm going to mention, that before I answer your question, is like Hans Morgenthau, who is like the one of my favorite political theorists, actually said that, like, look, the idea of foreign policy in to defend rights is basically not foreign policy itself. It's an ideological component that we shouldn't be there. I think that is slowly coming back in the United States. Part of the reason is structural. We are seeing, like, return to multipolarity. There are other great powers which have risen, and there is an asymmetry of interest. We don't want to go to war to defend something which we don't really feel passionate about. People don't really feel passionate about values after 20 years of wars in the Middle East and seeing nothing changing. So I think that is something which is changing. But on the other hand, like, we are kind of like seeing a return to a more anti-war and more interest oriented. So I wouldn't even call it an isolationist tendency, but like it's basically more oriented towards interest. And I think that is a return to an original sort of conservatism.
Yeah, it's interesting. Even the Monroe Doctrine, which is associated in many liberals' minds with this, nefarious CIA plots in Latin America and a kind of colonial project in the Western Hemisphere. If you read Monroe's original declaration or his proclamation of that doctrine, it has this kind of quote unquote isolationist vibe to it. He's saying we don't want to be involved anymore in the old world, but also we don't want them to come over here in our world, and we'll respect the rights of Latin American countries to govern themselves. We just don't want Spain and Portugal or whatever interfering anymore. That's an interesting data point that kind of goes with what you're saying, with Woodrow Wilson kind of being the turning point in American thought on this issue. Joseph, you want to talk about the contemporary political status of anti-war conservatism in the Trump administration, for example?
This is actually very far outside of my field.
Yeah, but the
So,
relevant factions and stuff. You can just talk about Trump and Rubio and those guys.
sure. So I think one of the there are a few different really approaches here. You have the restrainer faction, of course, and then you have sort of the holdovers, who are the old neocons, the establishment Republicans, and Donald Trump, uh, who kind of stands above in many ways all of the factions within his own presidency, uh, has selected from both sides. Obviously, the most prominent, probably sort of neocon pick for Trump was his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, who has since been promoted out of his position and will now find himself as ambassador to the United Nations, and so not
Maybe
really in
if he
calls with
gets
America.
confirmed. Yeah,
So
I'm
not
skeptical
really
he'll get
calls.
confirmed, but we'll see.
Yeah, the other big establishment pick that he chose was Marco Rubio at Secretary of State, who's also taken over the NSA for now. And while Rubio has in the past certainly shown some more neoconservative tendencies, he's had a long career in the Senate. Um, he seems to have largely followed the wind as far as a lot of foreign policy goes, and he's at least made the right noises to sort of edge back towards a uh, somewhat more uh, constrained view of American foreign policy, with the major exception, prominently, of Latin American affairs, where he's advocated a pretty aggressive approach in many ways. Um, on the restrainer side, then you have Pete Hegseth at the Department of Defense, um, and the of course Hegseth is in his own troubles, but you also have the Undersecretary Bridge Colby, who's relatively prominent there.
And JD Vance is thought to be kind of the main. I thought you were going to say, of course, you have JD Vance, because Pete Hegseth, I'm not sure that if he's a restrainer. There was some reporting by the New York Times that he was on the pro-restraint side when it came to Iran in particular, and so that was, good news. I was happy to read that. But overall, I can't really get a sense of him. He's written a book which has a very kind of crusading attitude about the Muslim world, which made me think he might be quite hawkish, at least on Middle East policies. But maybe that's not the case. But yeah, JD Vance definitely is seen as one of the restrainers. In that Signal group chat, he was the one expressing some, ambivalence and hesitancy about attacking the Houthi-controlled parts of Yemen. Steve Witkoff and Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard are also thought of as restrainers. I want to talk about Iran, and basically I want to, whether we go to war against Iran might very well depend on, the relative power of the restraint and hawkish constituencies and factions within the Republican Party. I do think that, people are getting excited that there are more pro-restraint voices, including prominent ones like Charlie Kirk. But when we look at the power of the restraint community, we really should look at their power relative to, the hawks, like the weapons manufacturers and the Israel lobby and other lobbies. There's like a Taiwan lobby and a Ukraine lobby now, and the donors. And I still tend to think that the anti-war faction is quite weak, relatively. Um, Trump, I do agree with you, Joseph. He tends to kind of stay above this. I think he likes having all this infighting below him. Possibly this infighting has produced this ambiguity about what the administration's goals are in its negotiations with Iran, whether it seeks the full dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program or just wants them to not have a nuclear weapon. Um, Trump recently said his most recent statement is that he hasn't decided, but there's been mixed signals sent continuously for like 2 months now. So, Sumatra, how do you think this is going to play out? Do you think we're going to go to war against Iran? And, how powerful is the anti-war side on this question, do you think?
I don't think they are quite as powerful as they are, shown to be. I think you're absolutely right. We do have, well, first of all, let's categorize the principles on our side who might be considered restrainer or at least like restrain interested. JD Vance, obviously. I think he's the prominent one. You're absolutely right. We should probably start with JD Vance. Like he's the guy who actually genuinely in every group chat or even like the easiest way to measure a man is to find out what he's saying when he's not recorded. And that is when we actually see that JD Vance is genuine, in his convictions. He doesn't want to go to war. Pete Hegseth, I don't think he's a restrainer. I have questions about his political or philosophical convictions anyway. I don't really have any. I don't. I mean, from what we have seen, I think I wouldn't go as far as to say that he's shallow, but I don't think I have not seen any deeper reflections coming out of Pete Hegseth when it comes to foreign policy. Marco Rubio, I know a lot of people in the US think that Marco Rubio has changed and he's making all the right noises. I am skeptical. And I have been skeptical on this issue for a long time. And nothing in the recent statements that I've seen from him has changed my mind on that one. And Marco Rubio talks a big game when it comes to how we are in multipolarity, we're not in unipolarity, and there are like other forces and stuff. But when you actually ask him pinpointed questions about policy related questions, like what we should do in this situation, his answers kind of go back to a more traditional Republican foreign policy. Like recently, I was listening to a speech of him, and I was when he was speaking in a conference, And when asked about what to do with NATO, he was like, "Yeah, NATO is our ally, and we should like make sure that they spend a lot more money." Well, yeah, but that is not going to happen. What then? That's not. He's not coming out and saying like, "Fine, we're just going to shift the burden to the Europeans when it comes to NATO." Same with Iran. Like, he's constantly hyping up the talking points of what Trump has said about, Iranians are not allowed to have nuclear weapons. Well, yes, but that is not the point here. The point is whether we should, sort of like be in a spiral and lead up to a conflict to Iran. So I'm not really sure of Marco Rubio's political convictions. I think the advantage that the realist or at least restrainer right has is this time they managed to put a whole bunch of sub-level officers who are more dovish or less hawkish when it comes to various levels of DSDs who are now currently working, NSC people, Bridge Colby. So I think those are some of the advantages that we have. Whether they can be reflected on a more macro level is something which we haven't seen. We haven't been in a war so far, but we also haven't stopped sending aid to Ukraine, or we haven't stopped doing anything when it comes to Iran. We can easily have, for example, the Abraham Accord. If Trump is having a problem with Israeli and Saudi cooperation, we can just have an Abraham Accords with the Arabs and the Persians. There are lots of other things that we can do. We can start talking with the North Koreans, for example. We can just unilaterally stop giving aid to the Ukrainians and say, like, by the way, good luck. This is Europe's war, and Europe can do it. There's a lot of things that we can do. We haven't seen any of them do it. So I'm not as hyped up about a restrainer right being in power. Yes, there are good trends, but there's a long way to go.
One of the things that I think we can definitely do is get a deal with Iran. If we just say they can have civilian
Absolutely.
nuclear energy, they can't have a weapon. We want inspections. I was honestly a bit disappointed by J.D. Vance's recent interview it was in D.C., but it was related to the Munich Security Conference. It's like Munich Security Leaders Conference or something. And he was asked about Iran. Some of what he said, I liked. But one of the points he made was that there are no countries that have a civilian nuclear energy program and not weapons. And we've heard this from some administration officials, and it's not true. I mean, the Netherlands, Japan, Germany, Brazil, they have civilian nuclear energy programs and they don't have nuclear weapons. I don't know why people keep saying this, and it's totally mystifying to me why there's been this ambiguity about what the administration's goals are. My guess is that they want Iran to fully dismantle its nuclear program, but they would settle for it, inspections. Another thing that JD Vance said that I didn't like, he said that the JCPOA, the Obama era Iran nuclear deal, was weak on inspections and monitoring, and that's not true. It was like an unprecedented level of monitoring. Like anytime, any place, if the relevant international organizations wanted to look at something, they had a right to under that agreement, and Iran was complying with it, as even Trump's White House in his first term conceded. So I'm getting quite worried about Iran, especially since the alternative to a deal is apparently we go to war with them. That's what Trump has been saying consistently. Joseph, if we're able to bet on who the next pope will be, I guess we can bet on whether there will be a war against Iran. What's your sense? What do you think the odds are for America going to war against Iran before we move on to the next topic?
I don't think so. Since I know that Trump has been making a big deal out of it, but I think that people need to recognize that that's kind of Trump's default way of doing things. Is he takes a very aggressive forward position and then tries to negotiate down from there. You can see this, with the tariffs on Canada and Mexico. You know, waving around very potentially damaging tariffs to Canada and Mexico over border enforcement. Um, Ultimately, some symbolic concessions were made, and Trump declared victory. Even though, especially like in with regard to Canada, essentially nothing actually happened. So I think that if we get to the point where Trump, uh, even if there's not a way to make some kind of deal that the administration is happy with, we're likely to see something like that where some kind of symbolic victory is declared, and then Trump says that is sufficient enough for us not to need to go to war with Iran. So that would be my expectation, just from what I've seen with the way that Trump approaches these kinds of negotiations.
Okay, interesting. I guess we could say one thing that pro-restraint people can be pleased about is that Trump, during his meeting with Carney, the Canadian Prime Minister, announced that the U.S. would stop bombing Yemen. The Houthis had extended an offer kind of informally. I think it was reported by Dropsite News. That might have been the main vector that this offer was extended, um, to stop attacking American ships, or to say they wouldn't. I don't even know if they were at the time that we started bombing them. I don't think so. But in any case, Trump said he accepted that offer, and he, will honor their promise and trust that they'll follow through on it. So that's quite interesting. It indicates a certain pragmatism, because apparently it wasn't working and it was like super costly, this bombing campaign. Speaking of the Carney meeting, this would be a good segue, and I'll turn it to you again, Joseph. So Mark Carney, obviously, you know, there's been some tension between the U.S. and Canada during the Trump administration because of his tariffs and because of his goal of annexing Canada, and making it a 51st state. So Mark Carney, the new prime minister, came to the White House. He met with Trump. What happened during that meeting, Joseph?
Yeah, so obviously the first thing is, Carney was elected with the expectation that he is going to stand up to Trump. And so, he had to do that. He had to push back. So he told Trump, Canada's not for sale. He made the speech, but at the same time, obviously, the Carney, is an economist. He's extremely aware of the dependence that the United States has on Canada. And so, at the same time as he made the rhetorical pushback, he obviously was also hoping to lay grounds for a much more sustainable relationship between the US and Canada, um, as opposed to
Did you mean to
relatively
say?
cold.
Did you mean to say the dependence that Canada has on the U.S. or does
Yes,
the U.S.?
sorry.
Yeah,
No, no.
you're good.
Yeah, Carney is aware that Canada is very dependent on the US. Um, And so, obviously, what he's hoping to do is diffuse these tensions that have built up. And I think that he has a pretty good chance to do so. Um, Trump did not like Trudeau, called him governor, made fun of him, for whatever reason, um, really disliked Trudeau. And a lot of the jabs that Trump made towards Canada were at Trudeau's expense. Carney, on the other hand, seems to me a lot like Claudia Scheinbaum in the sense that he's a relatively cool technocrat, uh, with a very, like, non-confrontational, policy-oriented approach. And it seems like Trump actually gets along well with those kinds of people and feels like he can make deals with them. Uh, and so I think that and Trump basically said as much, he said, "I haven't called him Governor Carney, maybe I won't." Um, so in that sense
What a
so in
concession.
that sense, I think that Carney's visit to the United States was a relative success for him. I think he came off well. I think that he probably has a good chance to cool down potential tensions with between the US and Canada and establish a more cooperative relationship there. So,
Sumantra, your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I don't have much to add. I think Carney, of all the people that one can call governor, Carney is probably the one. Like that man is kind of man like people don't really make anymore. Like he's an Oxford grad in economics who was a banker of Bank of England and is now ruling Canada. Like that is almost like from 1860s. So we actually we can call Carney like not just governor but governor general. But But that being said, I think the most important point that you raised, Joseph, is something which I agree. Trump instinctively works well with competent technocrats, and Scheinbaum is one of them who avoided a lot of issues with Trump. And the southern border is, proof is in the pudding. Like the southern border is actually really quiet. Um, Starmer just recently concluded a trade deal that Tories were constantly harping about in the UK. Like this, if we are talking about post Brexit benefit, like this is the post Brexit benefit that we were talking about. And UK just conducted two trade deals, one with India and one with the United States, two of the largest consumer markets, and it was under Trump and Starmer. So again, a left wing technocrat. Albanese in Australia, who's won the election recently, is a better relation than the right wing guy who was running for, I don't even know his name, who was constantly talking about like how Trump is a dictator and all that kind of stuff. And now Carney in Canada. So I think that is going to cool down some of the tempers that we have seen so far play. I do think Canada is far, far more important for the United States foreign policy than anything else, given that it's a direct neighbor. And I also don't think antagonizing a whole bunch of Canadians works well in our favor. Like this is a country which is right next to Alaska. It's going to be an important partner if something happens in the Arctic tomorrow. Like my brain goes directly to foreign policy every time I think of a topic. Like that's just how I'm wired to do. Like my first instinct is just like, what are the foreign policy ramifications of this? And I think this is a good thing. Like Trump is having a good relation with Carney when it comes to Canada. How Canada and Canadians rule their own countries, none of our business. We live in America, and if Canadians have a stable government and they want to have a good trade deal with us, great.
Yeah, there's kind of an interesting Nixon goes to China element here where right conservatives or populists in other countries, they have to kind of demonstrate to their, domestic populations that they're standing up to Trump. But Carney, after he gets elected, he can come to the Oval Office and have a nice meeting. Starmer can come to the Oval Office and extend an invitation to do a state visit with the monarchy and say nice things to Trump, because people in their countries know that they're basically opposed ideologically to Trump. I thought the Oval Office meeting was quite interesting. I think all of these Oval Office meetings that Trump is doing with foreign leaders are super interesting because he's really changed the nature of these meetings where he's just holding court like for a long period of time, asking all these questions. It's very unscripted. His guest is just kind of sitting there watching Trump talk. Trump is such an alpha male, and like that aspect of his personality is like the most important thing about him. Where when you're watching Carney, like it kind of reminded me of when Trump won in 2016 and all the liberals were going crazy. And then he went to the New York Times to do some interview, and we got to hear the audio recordings. And you could hear Trump make a joke, and all the New York Times columnists who have been saying he's like the next Hitler, they're like laughing, and they can't help themselves of kind of deferring to him personally. He has this kind of power about him. And we saw that on display in the Oval Office where Carney, who has been at home talking about how he's going to stand up to Trump, he's laughing at his jokes. He looks like a little nervous, of like this wild animal might attack him at any moment or something. Somehow this just kind of works for Trump. I will say, I think Trump, I've come to believe that Trump is serious about this idea of his of making Canada a 51st state. Like he's not backing down on it. And the Meet the Press interview that he did for his 100 days, first 100 days interview, he was very clear. He's like, no, I really do want to do this. Even during the meeting after Carney said, Canada is not for sale, that's never going to happen, Trump said, well, never say never. Like I don't think it's just this like big negotiating stance. I think he means it. We'll see.
I think the funniest thing that Trump was when he was talking about Greenland a few days back was like, yeah, we really want Greenland to be our 51st state. And then, but the Greenlanders don't really want that. So it takes two to tango. I think it's just a funny guy. Yeah, I do think, Trump Trump lives in my mind, Trump lives between, say, 1890 to 1950. Like he talks about Alcatraz, like being a prison in California. Like that guy has got, I don't think he knows about the supermax prisons that the U.S. has these days. I think the vibe in his mind is the more of a 1950s kind of guy, like Escape from L.A. and all that. So so he wants his own legacy. He wants to increase dominion of the U.S. Peacefully. Obviously, that's a very American ethos. If some other places want to come and join on their own will without going for a conquest, that's great. That is a good thing. I just don't think he's going to get his way with Canada. Greenland is a different question. We are working towards that, hopefully. But Canada is Canadians don't really want to join the U.S.
Hey, to be fair to Trump, and attempting to annex Canada is a very traditionally American attitude.
It's an American thing.
I mean, not for a while. It hasn't been. When's the last time that was a live issue? Before Trump made it one. How does he even get these ideas in his head, do you think? Like they seem to come out of nowhere.
Watch TV.
It might be a negotiating thing. Trump does like to make these really big demands. And then, as you mentioned, Joseph, Mark Carney in the meeting, he was talking about the importance of having a strong partnership and maybe Canada could do something. He was talking about all these things that Trump has been asking for, like cooperation on fentanyl and border security, for example. So maybe it's all one big strange gambit by Trump.
I think that Trump is being sincere, personally. I think Trump sees Canada, he's like, you know, it's basically economically integrated with the US. We have in many ways relatively similar histories and heritages. Uh Canada's dependent on the US for its defense. Like, why not just make it one thing?
Yeah. Yeah, I
I
agree. I
don't
do
think
think
he
he's
would
being
like go
sincere.
far to pursue that, but I think that's one of the things that people like about Trump, that's endearing about him, is he speaks his mind, even when it's kind of silly.
um, let's go ahead and move on to something that's very not silly and sort of alarming, although I'm not sure exactly how alarmed to be, which is the new India Pakistan war. Sumantra, can you fill us in on what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, that's like I'm gonna go do a Vladimir Putin and start with the history of like the Muhammad of Ghori's invasion of India in the 980 and so. Look, this has been happening for like more than 1,000 years. The approximate cause of this current conflict is what the Indians say is a Pakistani terrorist attack in Kashmir, which killed a lot of tourists who were going to Kashmir. Kashmir has relatively stabilized in the last 4 or 5 years, or like 10 years. There has been like conflicts here and there, and like in 2019 there was this tit for tat bombing that happened, but mostly the kind of low simmering insurgency that was there has sort of stabilized. So tourism increased. So there were a bunch of tourists who were traveling to Kashmir, and then there was a bunch of terrorist attacks. And what they did was they specifically targeted Hindus, and told and didn't kill their wives, and killed all the men, but did not target the women. So the Indian, bombing campaign that happened in Pakistan was named as Operation Sindoor, which is the vermilion that Indian married women put on their forehead if they're married. So that they had kind of like a religious symbolism to that too, which is very unusual for usually a secular Indian army to name their operations after a more of a religious aspect of it. But anyway, so that terrorist attack happened. Apparently, the Indians did some missile strikes in various parts of Pakistan, which are not in Pakistani occupied Kashmir, but also in like mainland Pakistan in the south. And then the story gets more confusing because both the Pakistani sides and Reuters and other Western journalists have confirmed that the Pakistanis sort of used standoff weapons from their side. So no planes from each side, no fighter jets from each side, crossed over to the other side. But they used standoff BVR, beyond visual range weapons from each side, and targeted the jets. And Indians lost like 2 or 3 jets, apparently. Again, this is completely unconfirmed, other than the fact that we know that India lost some jets, or at least one jet in this fight, but no one actually knows what happened because BVR weapons were used, so no one could actually collect debris from their side of the country. So there's a lot of claims and counterclaims going on. And then recently, the Indians have stopped doing that. And what they tried to do was like send a whole bunch of Israeli made cheap drones to probe Pakistani air defense. And when the Pakistani signal jammed and locked the drones, they bombed or missile strike those drones, those anti-aircraft sites. So that is where we are standing now. Um, the chances of escalation this time seems very high. I don't think, even though both the Pakistani and the Indian statements are constantly talking about how they're proportionate and measured responses and are geared towards de-escalation and they're non-escalatory in nature, but they are not also trying to give the other side any kind of off ramp. And they're keeping on saying like, whatever happens, we're going to have escalation dominance. The question of escalation dominance is a material construct. It doesn't depend on what the one side is saying. If both sides want to ride on this spiral and go up, this spiral is just going to keep spiraling. So there is a huge risk of a regional conflict. Um, the next few days, or at least the next 1 week, will be really important to see. Like if we see random massive number of field hospitals being set up on either side, or massive number of troop movements that's happening, or the railway, signal jamming have changed to have the railways transport troops, or if we see the Indian Navy moving towards Pakistan, then there's definitely a regional war that's coming. If we don't see those signs in the next few days, the chances are it's going to slow down a little bit.
I have two questions. So the first one is, is there actually any evidence that the Pakistani government was involved in coordinating this terrorist attack? It seems like a lot of people are just kind of taking that for granted. Do you know?
Yeah, there is no hard evidence that was provided by the Indians, but apparently the Indians have shared some of the evidence of signal chats between terror groups and some of the Pakistani intelligence community. The question of, the question is interesting because it's always difficult to actually prove anything happening from the Pakistani side, because there is always a sense of plausible deniability since at least the 1970s. Even when during the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks, they found active, Pakistani training to given to these terrorists. There was always this deniability saying that, by the way, those were rogue elements within the Pakistani intelligence community, and it's not the act of Pakistani state. So regardless of what happens, unless there is an actual invasion of Pakistan and taking over Islamabad and going out in the archival evidence of what happening, it's very difficult to prove. That being said, even through that lens, I don't think the Indians have done or tried to prove beyond reasonable doubt that there was an active Pakistani element in this last terror attack. No.
Yeah, similar to when bin Laden was killed and when he was hiding out in Pakistan, there seemed to be
Yeah,
some plausible deniability, but it's like, okay, someone in the government probably knew that Osama bin Laden was in a compound in
that's right.
Pakistan. And
Yeah,
then the American government obviously didn't trust the Pakistanis because they didn't tell them about this
yeah,
operation.
same.
The second question is, what is the relative power between India and Pakistan in terms of their conventional military capabilities? Because I'm worried that if India is significantly stronger than Pakistan, Pakistan, as I understand, has a fairly loose nuclear doctrine where they're willing to resort to nuclear weapons a bit more quickly than other countries. I think in part because they're worried that India is much more powerful than them. But is there any kind of parity here? Do you know?
So the interesting strategy, the strategic doctrine of Pakistan, which pretty much like every Indian strategic analyst like studies, like that's one of the first things that they go to military schools. They're going to study that. That is their mode of conduct, and then comes China. Pakistanis are very good at escalating suboptimal and then stopping, because they have this. There is no parity between the conventional Indian forces. India is like a People misunderstand just how big India is. It is a continent in itself. It has got the number of the amount of population in India is more than 3.5 times Europe, and it's also a huge landmass. The moving troops from the center, for example, where all the troops are based, to the border it's a cumbersome process, and the Pakistanis are very good at probing those and like escalating beyond the suboptimal range, and then toning down by the time the Indians have actually mobilized troops. Like last time it happened was in 2001, where Indians mobilized almost 500,000 troops in the border, but no one actually went and crossed the border, because by the time they went there, the Pakistanis were ready because they could see them coming from a mile away, and it took like 2.5 months to mobilize the entire amount of troops. This time it's different because both sides are using stand-up weapons. The conventional parity is lopsided in this equation because the Indians have a lot more when it comes to these things. Not just tanks, but like missiles and drones, and there's simply like GDP. Like if you mobilize 1 million men in the border and keep them there placed for like 2.5 months, that is a lot of expenditure. Now, if the Indians do that and then not even go to war, the Pakistanis will have to do that too, and that would cripple their economic background. If the Indian Navy, for example, lays a siege to the Karachi port, like that is the only city that's like their Mumbai, that's like their London, and so their economic, things are going to crash. So you're right. The Indians have a lot of option to do that, but on the other hand, the Pakistanis have a lot of option to escalate when it comes to the nuclear weapons, because their nuclear, threshold is a lot lower than Indians. The Indian nuclear threshold, India has a second strike, option. Like the Indians will only use nuclear weapons after nuclear weapons have been introduced in a theater, which is a weird way of saying like after they've been struck with nuclear weapons, they've got a second strike capability. The Pakistanis don't have that, so their threshold of using nuclear weapons is whenever their state or a stability of their state is threatened. That is vague. and it could be interpreted in any way. If the Pakistani, and who is the Pakistani state in this case anyway? Is this the Pakistani intelligence, the Pakistani army, which decides everything, in their country? If tomorrow they feel threatened, will they, resort to nuclear weapons? These are the questions which are unanswered, and no one wants to find that out, obviously. So I think you're right. There is a lot of lopsided, power when it comes to India and Pakistan. But I mean, the risk of raising it to a nuclear threshold is also really high.
Joseph, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the interesting question is to what extent the uh, the Pakistanis are really willing to press India, because it seems like a lot of this is testing from the Pakistanis. The Indians, of course, are struck first, but Pakistan is, of course, aware of the fact that they're much smaller and poorer than India, just as a relative matter of mass, as Sumantra said. And so the question is, how far are the Pakistanis willing to push? Because at some point, the Indian government might say, okay, like, we're just getting tired of being tested like this, and so we're going to take some pretty severe measures. And when that happens, then the Pakistanis may not have a choice and may find themselves in an engagement that they didn't want. I think it's notable that from the reports that we have, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for war in the Pakistani population like there has been in the past when there have been confrontations with India. Um, but that could change very quickly. So,
Yeah, we'll keep tabs on this. It's definitely an important situation. I think it's a little too late in the episode for us to talk about the AFD situation. I'll just kind of fill our listeners in briefly. So basically, the domestic spy agency in Germany labeled the Alternative for Germany Party an extremist organization. And that's a designation that would allow the agency to spy on the party very extensively. And it could set the stage for banning the party entirely. The AFD is the most popular party in the entire country, according to some polls. So banning it would really disenfranchise a huge percentage of the population. I think around a quarter of Germans. Today, we learned that the extremist classification has been paused. AFD had contested the designation in court, and now they've won a temporary injunction. So hopefully, from my perspective, hopefully the court will block the agency's move. And this is just the latest example in a series of anti-democratic moves by EU states against right populist parties. We saw in France, Marine Le Pen was found guilty on these trumped-up embezzlement charges and banned from running for president in 2027, I think. In Romania, election results were just tossed out when the right-wing candidate won, and then he was banned from running in the redo election. Um, and I guess I don't have much to say about this issue. I have been interested to note that a lot of people who are objecting to this are using kind of the discourse of democracy, saying this is an anti-democratic act. And I agree with that. And that's probably the most rhetorically effective way to go. But it does seem to me that people should also kind of address the substance of the charge a little more forthrightly. Basically, they were labeled extremist on grounds that they're nativist and that they're ethnic nationalist because members of their party say that the German people are defined by common ancestry. I guess I'll be as controversial as I could possibly be and say, yeah, I think the proper response to this is to say that actually, the German people do exist. Like they are real people, just like Japanese people, Chinese people, Indian people, Pakistanis exist. And it's their right to say so. Germany is named after the German people, not the other way around. And it's kind of ridiculous that this extremist label would be pinned on them, simply because some members of their party. And if you look at what we know from this report that was held secret, but parts of it were released. If you look at the evidence of extremism, I mean, it's pretty alarming. Like it's just normal immigration restrictionist ideas that some people in the AFD have. It's nothing neo-Nazi, as far as I can tell, although we haven't seen the whole report. So that's my little rant. And I guess that's a good segue to picks of the week, because I want to pick this one article, German Democracy is in Peril, by Dieter Stein. He's an editor at one of the main conservative papers in Germany, and he uses this, this, this this kind of anti-democratic charge. That's his main point. He doesn't get into the thing that I was just talking about, but he just is clearly, genuinely very worried about the state of German democracy and thinks that this is all heading in a frightening direction. And I found his article very interesting to read. Sumantra, what's your pick of the week?
I take Spencer Neal's Singapore Stays the Course. Singapore is a place which is very close to my heart. I have been to Singapore many times. It's one of the most beautiful places you can go. But the interesting thing about Singapore is the kind of political questions it provokes in me. Singapore is a hugely multi-ethnic, multiracial society. It has got like Chinese population, it's got Malaysians, it's got Indians, but it doesn't have any of the problems that other multi-ethnic societies has. And the only reason that one can even plausibly think of is like it's like, as Lee Kuan Yew once said, like you cannot have a classical liberal democracy. You can have democracy, but you cannot have a classical essence of liberal democracy and order at the same time. If the choice between those two comes into foreplay, you would have to choose order over democracy. And I think that is one of the reasons why Singapore has stayed so calm and has maintained peace between various communities and actually have a Singaporean identity. And Spencer writes about how the political party of Lee Kuan Yew wins every single time for the last 60, 65 years. And I think it's a very important case study for any of us who are living in our current times to decide on how to orderize our societies in a way that is orderly.
Yeah, I was teaching a class at Northwestern, and I had like 6 students who were all friends from Singapore, and I remember thinking, "Wait, you're all Singaporean? Like you look totally different." So that's quite interesting. I haven't read that article yet. I need to. I talked to Spencer about it while he was writing it. Joseph, what's your pick of the week?
Yeah, my pick of the week is It's Not Too Late to Get Admin Staffing Right by Jude Russo, published today. It's a good look at the Trump administration's personnel and some of the problems that have been going on there and what to do about it.
Yep, that's a good piece too. So that brings us to the end of today's episode. I want to thank our listeners for sticking around until the end and remind them that you can also watch this episode on YouTube at the American Conservative channel. So please subscribe to our channel on YouTube and smash that like button. And I want to thank you, Joseph, and you, Sumantra, for a great discussion. See you next time.